I am Tracy, 34 years old, and last summer the VP's son fired me with a smirk, calling me a lost cause. Little did he know that 3 months later, during the company's license audit, a lawyer would ask the question that made the room go silent. Why is her name on the $89 million license the blood drained from? Bradley's face as his empire began crumbling before my eyes. Getting fired was the best thing that ever happened to me. Before I dive into this wild journey, drop a comment letting me know where you're watching from. Hit that like and subscribe button if you've ever stood up against workplace injustice. Trust me, you'll want to see how this unfolds. My journey into software licensing wasn't planned. After college, I stumbled into a tech company needing someone to organize their software assets. What started as an entry-level position evolved into a decade of specializing in software compliance and licensing. I became known for my attention to detail and ethical approach in an industry where cutting corners is temptingly easy. When Vertex Technologies posted an opening for a senior licensing specialist, I jumped at the opportunity. Vertex had been making waves, with innovative business intelligence software growing from a startup to a company valued at $89 million in just 7 years. Their flagship product, DataSense, was revolutionizing how medium-sized businesses handled data analytics. The position offered a substantial salary increase and the prestige of working for a rising star in the tech world. My interview with Amanda Chen, the compliance director, went brilliantly. She seemed impressed with my experience and the methodical way I approached complex licensing scenarios. "Tracy, your background is exactly what we need as we scale," she said, her voice warm with approval. "We're preparing for potential audits as our profile rises, and someone with your expertise would be invaluable." I met briefly with Marcus Reynolds, the founder and CEO, during my second interview. Tall with silver temples and an easy smile, he exuded the confidence of someone who had built something substantial from nothing. "Amanda speaks highly of you," he said, glancing at my resume. "We need people who understand the foundation our business is built on. Software licenses might seem boring to some, but they're our lifeblood." I was thrilled when they offered me the position. My first few weeks at Vertex were a whirlwind of learning their systems, meeting colleagues, and understanding their complex web of software licenses. The company occupied 3 floors of a glass tower downtown with sleek modern decor and motivational quotes about innovation and disruption on the walls. It didn't take long to notice the company culture was intensely competitive. Success was celebrated publicly while mistakes were addressed in hushed, tense conversations behind closed doors. The executive floor, where Marcus and other senior leaders had their offices, had an entirely different atmosphere from the rest of the building. The air felt thinner somehow, conversations more measured. It was during my 3rd week that I first met Bradley Reynolds, Marcus's son, and the vice president of operations. Where Marcus carried his success with a relaxed confidence, Bradley wore his authority like an expensive but ill-fitting suit. In his early 30s, maybe a year younger than me, he had none of his father's warmth or genuine interest in the business. In meetings, he would interrupt others, take credit for team ideas, and speak about employees as resources rather than people. "So you're the new licensing guru," he said during our first encounter, not bothering to remember my name. "Just make sure we're compliant enough to avoid problems, but not wasting money on licenses we don't need." He winked as if we were conspirators in some scheme. That same week, I met Jessica Miller from accounting. Unlike many others who maintained a professional distance, Jessica was genuinely friendly. During lunch one day, she filled me in on some company background. "Marcus built this place from nothing," she explained, picking at her salad. "Started coding DataSense in his garage, classic tech success story. Brought Bradley in about 4 years ago, straight out of his MBA program." "Is that when the company really started growing?" I asked. Jessica gave a small laugh. "That's the official story. The reality is that growth exploded after Marcus acquired the SynthLogic framework that powers our analytics engine. Bradley had nothing to do with it, but he takes credit at every investor meeting." As I settled into my role, I began a comprehensive review of Vertex's licensing structures. Most were straightforward, but the SynthLogic license that Jessica had mentioned caught my attention. This powerful software framework was the engine behind DataSense's most impressive features, yet the documentation seemed unusually thin. When I requested the original licensing agreement from the legal department, Daniel Harris, the company lawyer, seemed hesitant. "That's sensitive material," he said, pushing his glasses up. "I'll need to get approval." "Why do you need it?" "Just doing my due diligence," I replied. "If we're preparing for potential audits, I should understand all our major licenses." The document I eventually received raised immediate concerns. The license terms seemed unusually favorable for a framework as powerful as SynthLogic. Furthermore, several amendments had been added with different fonts and formatting, suggesting they'd been altered after the initial agreement. When I raised these issues with Amanda during our weekly one-on-one, her usual friendly demeanor shifted subtly. "These licenses were handled at the executive level," she said, her voice tight. "I'm sure everything is in order. Just focus on preparing our audit readiness documentation." That evening, as I was leaving, I spotted Marcus and Bradley in the glass-walled conference room engaged in what appeared to be a heated discussion. Bradley was gesturing emphatically while Marcus looked concerned, occasionally shaking his head. As my first month drew to a close, I was assigned to prepare for a routine internal audit, a precursor to the external audit scheduled later in the year. I threw myself into the task determined to prove my value. Little did I know that my thoroughness would start unraveling threads that powerful people had carefully tucked away, or that my name was already tied to documents I had never signed or approved. The dream job I had been so excited about was slowly revealing itself to be built on a foundation of sand, and with each question I asked, the tide was rising. The discrepancies in the SynthLogic license continued to bother me. As I prepared for the internal audit, something wasn't adding up. According to the company's valuation documents that I'd been given, access to the SynthLogic framework accounted for nearly 70% of DataSense's core functionality. Yet the licensing costs recorded in our systems were suspiciously low for such a critical component. I decided to dig deeper, tracing the license back to its origin. This meant late nights comparing version histories, reviewing payment records, and examining user deployment numbers. After 2 weeks of investigation, I compiled my findings into a detailed report. The evidence pointed to a troubling conclusion. Vertex was deploying SynthLogic far beyond the scope of our license agreement, potentially constituting millions of dollars in licensing violations. With my report complete, I scheduled a meeting with Amanda to discuss the findings before the internal audit. Her office was meticulously organized with certificates and awards carefully arranged on one wall. When I walked her through my analysis, her expression changed from interest to concern to something that looked unsettlingly like fear. "This is very thorough, Tracy," she said, flipping through the pages. "But I think you may be overcomplicating things." The SynthLogic arrangement was handled directly by Marcus and the previous licensing manager. "That's part of the problem," I explained. "There's no clear documentation of any special arrangement, just these amended terms that don't match standard SynthLogic licensing structures." Amanda closed the report and leaned forward. "Look, I appreciate your diligence, but this level of detail will only confuse the audit team. Simplify this before the meeting, focus on our compliance strengths, rather than these theoretical concerns." I left her office feeling deflated. I had expected Amanda to be alarmed and take immediate action. Instead, she wanted me to dilute my findings. Against my better judgment, I revised the report, highlighting compliance wins and relegating the SynthLogic concerns to a brief section at the end. The internal audit meeting took place in the main conference room with 15 people present, including Bradley Reynolds. I noticed he paid little attention until I reached the section on SynthLogic. And finally I said, "There are some inconsistencies in our SynthLogic licensing that may warrant further investigation before the external audit." Bradley straightened in his chair. "What kind of inconsistencies?" "The deployment scope exceeds our license parameters by approximately 300%, I explained, "and there appear to be unauthorized amendments to the original agreement." The room temperature seemed to drop 10 degrees. Bradley's casual posture transformed into something rigid and defensive. "These technical details are unnecessary complications," he said dismissively. "The SynthLogic agreement has special terms negotiated at the executive level. Right, Amanda?" Amanda nodded quickly. "Yes, Tracy is new and doesn't have the full historical context." I felt my face flush with embarrassment and confusion. But the documentation doesn't support any special arrangement, I persisted. If auditors request verification, we could face significant penalties. Bradley's smile didn't reach his eyes. I think you're overstepping your role here. Your job is to manage day-to-day compliance, not question executive decisions. I looked to Amanda for support, but she was studiously examining her notepad. The meeting moved on, but the damage was done. I had been publicly undermined, my professional judgment questioned. After the meeting, I retreated to my office, replaying the interaction in my mind. Had I really misunderstood something fundamental about the license, or was I witnessing a deliberate cover-up? That afternoon, Jessica stopped by my office and closed the door. You okay? That was rough in there. I sighed. I don't understand what happened. The evidence is clear that we're using SynthLogic beyond our license scope. Jessica lowered her voice. You're not the first person to notice. Keith from the previous compliance team raised similar questions last year. What happened to him? Suddenly underperforming, according to HR. Let go during a restructuring 3 months later. She hesitated. There have been others too. Anyone who looks too closely at certain arrangements tends to have short careers here. A chill ran down my spine. So I should just ignore potential violations that could cost the company millions. I'm just saying be careful. Bradley protects anything connected to the SynthLogic deal like a mother bear. It's what transformed this company from a modest success to a major player. Over the next few days, I noticed subtle changes in how colleagues interacted with me. Conversations would stop when I approached. Meeting invitations decreased. Amanda began copying Bradley on all our email exchanges. Determined to understand what I was up against, I continued my investigation discreetly after hours. One evening, while reviewing a batch of licensing documents from the legal archive, I discovered something that made my blood run cold. The most recent amendment to the SynthLogic license, dated 6 months earlier, listed me as the designated licensing authority for Vertex Technologies. My name and an approximation of my signature appeared on a document created months before I joined the company. I checked and rechecked, hoping I was mistaken. I wasn't. Someone had not only forged my signature, but made me the responsible party for a potentially massive licensing violation. If SynthLogic initiated an audit, I would be personally named as the authorizing agent for the improper usage. The implications were staggering. This wasn't just corporate corner-cutting. It was deliberate fraud that made me the scapegoat for decisions made long before my arrival. The dream job I had been so excited about had just become a nightmare, and I was legally entangled in something I had no part in creating. I made copies of all relevant documents and stored them securely both in the office and at home. Whatever was happening at Vertex, I was now certain of one thing I needed to protect myself before the whole house of cards came tumbling down. The morning after discovering my forged signature, I requested an urgent meeting with Amanda. She seemed irritated by my insistence, but agreed to a brief conversation before her executive committee meeting. I found something concerning, I said, closing her office door. I placed the SynthLogic amendment on her desk. This document lists me as the designated licensing authority and appears to have my signature, but it's dated 3 months before I joined Vertex. Amanda barely glanced at the paper. These are standard procedural updates. When you joined, we transferred responsibility to you. The date probably reflects when the original amendment was created. But I never signed this, I insisted, and I never agreed to be the responsible party for this license. Amanda sighed, checking her watch. This is standard procedure in enterprise software licensing. When a new compliance person joins, they assume responsibility for existing arrangements. Your predecessor's name was removed, and yours was added. Without informing me, that's not standard in any company I've worked for. Different companies have different protocols, she said, standing to indicate our meeting was over. If you have concerns about taking responsibility for our licensing compliance, perhaps we should discuss whether this role is the right fit for you. I left her office feeling gaslit and threatened. Amanda's explanation contradicted basic legal and professional standards. No reputable company would transfer legal responsibility without disclosure and consent. Over the next few days, I noticed my system access becoming increasingly restricted. Folders I had previously been able to view showed access denied messages. When I inquired with IT, they claimed it was a system update issue that would resolve itself. One evening working late, I overheard Bradley and Marcus in the conference room next to my office. Not wanting to eavesdrop, I was about to make my presence known when I heard my name. "Tracy's asking too many questions about synth logic," Bradley said, just like Richards did last year. "Is she talking to anyone outside the company?" Marcus asked, his voice concerned. "Not that we know of. IT is monitoring her communications." My heart pounded. They were surveilling me. "The external audit is in 8 weeks," Marcus continued. "We need to make sure everything looks clean. SynthTech has a new audit team that's been aggressive with other clients." "I'm handling it," Bradley assured him. "Trust me, by the time the auditors arrive, there won't be any issues." I stayed frozen until they left, then gathered my things and went home mind racing. They were monitoring my communications and explicitly discussing hiding information from auditors. This went beyond unethical into potentially criminal territory. The next morning, I found myself removed from the audit preparation committee with no explanation. When I questioned Amanda, she claimed it was to allow me to focus on other priorities, though no new priorities were identified. In the break room, Jessica subtly slid a note across the table while chatting about weekend plans. Later, in the privacy of a bathroom stall, I read, "They're building a case against you. Document everything. Careful what you put in emails or say on company phones." That afternoon, Bradley called an impromptu team meeting where he announced a streamlining of the licensing verification process. The new procedure removed several checks and balances I had implemented and centralized approval authority with him and Amanda. "These changes will make us more agile," he explained with corporate buzzwords that meant nothing. What they would actually do is make it easier to hide licensing violations. As everyone filed out, Bradley asked me to stay behind. Once we were alone, his friendly facade dropped. "You seem to be struggling to adapt to our culture, Tracy," he said, leaning against the conference table. "I've reviewed your recent work, and I'm concerned about your focus on theoretical problems rather than solutions. If by theoretical problems you mean potential license violations that could cost millions, then yes, I've been focused on those," I replied, struggling to keep my voice level. His eyes narrowed. "Watch your tone. Remember that performance reviews are coming up, and I have significant input into those decisions." The threat was clear. Fall in line or face consequences. That evening, I called an attorney friend for advice, careful to use my personal phone from outside the office. She recommended documenting everything and learning about whistleblower protections, but warned that the process could be lengthy and difficult. The next few weeks brought escalating tension. Bradley began criticizing my work in emails copied to the entire department. Tasks would be assigned to me at 5 p.m. with deadlines the next morning. Amanda started sending weekly performance concern notes to HR, each highlighting minor issues blown out of proportion. Meanwhile, I continued gathering evidence discreetly. Jessica proved an invaluable ally, passing me information from accounting that showed just how significant the SynthLogic license was to the company's operations and valuation. "The entire $89 million valuation hinges on our DataSense product," Jessica whispered during a rare moment alone, "and 70% of DataSense functionality comes from SynthLogic components. If we lost that license, the company would collapse overnight." The pieces finally fit together. Vertex had built its empire on improperly licensed software, putting my name on the documents to shield the executives from liability. The upcoming external audit threatened to expose the entire scheme. One Thursday afternoon, a calendar invitation appeared in my inbox: performance review meeting with Bradley Reynolds and Heather from HR, scheduled for the following morning. No additional context was provided, but the meaning was clear. They were making their move. I spent that night copying all my evidence to secure locations and preparing for what would likely be my last day at Vertex Technologies. As much as I had once loved this job, it had become clear that integrity and truth had no place in Bradley Reynolds' empire. Little did I know just how spectacularly that empire would soon come crashing down. Friday morning arrived with a sense of inevitable doom. I dressed carefully in my most professional outfit, a navy blue suit that had always given me confidence. Whatever happened in that meeting, I would face it with dignity. The conference room they'd chosen was small, with no windows. Bradley sat on one side of the table, a thin folder in front of him, while Heather from HR occupied the chair beside him, her expression carefully neutral. A third chair across from them awaited me like an electric chair awaits its occupant. "Please sit down, Tracy Heather," said her voice artificially pleasant. "We need to discuss some concerns about your performance." Bradley didn't bother with pleasantries. "We've documented multiple instances where your work has fallen below company standards," he began, opening the folder. "Missed deadlines, unnecessarily complex reports, questioning established company procedures, and creating a negative atmosphere in your department." Each accusation was either completely fabricated or a twisted version of events where my thoroughness was recast as obstruction. I listened silently as Bradley built his case, occasionally sliding documents across the table for me to view. Each page contained meticulously documented evidence of my supposed incompetence. "Do you have anything to say in response?" Heather finally asked. "These allegations misrepresent my work and my intentions," I replied calmly. "I've consistently acted in the best interest of Vertex by identifying compliance risks and suggesting corrections to protect the company." Bradley's face hardened. "Your job was to manage our licensing program as directed, not to question business decisions made at the executive level. My professional obligation is to ensure proper compliance," I countered. "When I discovered potentially serious licensing violations that put the company at risk, it was my duty to report them." "That's your interpretation," Bradley snapped. "We see it as failure to adapt to company culture and insubordination." Heather cleared her throat. "After reviewing all the documentation, we've made the decision to terminate your employment effective immediately." Though I'd been expecting it, the words still hit like a physical blow. I'd never been fired in my professional life. Bradley couldn't contain his smirk as he added, "Lost cause removed," just loud enough for me to hear. What followed was a humiliating ritual familiar to anyone who's been terminated. Heather explained the details of my final paycheck and continuation of benefits. I was required to surrender my security badge and laptop. A security guard appeared to escort me to my desk to collect personal belongings, then to the exit. Colleagues watched with mixed expressions of sympathy and discomfort as I packed my few personal items into a cardboard box. No one spoke to me directly. Association with the fired employee might contaminate them, too. As the security guard led me toward the elevator, my phone buzzed with a text from Jessica. "This is wrong. Call me when you're safe." The walk through the lobby with my small box of possessions felt interminable. Outside, the bright spring sunshine seemed to mock my situation. I made it to my car before the tears started, a mixture of rage, humiliation, and relief washing over me. That evening, Jessica called from a coffee shop several blocks from the office. "They're saying you were let go for performance issues," she said. "But everyone who's worked with you knows that's garbage." "I expected as much," I replied, my voice hoarse from crying. "Did they announce who's taking over my position?" "Bradley's college roommate starts Monday," Jessica said with disgust. The job listing was never even posted publicly. The weeks that followed were some of the darkest of my life. I applied for dozens of positions in my field, only to discover I'd been effectively blacklisted. One hiring manager, an old colleague, confidentially informed me that Bradley had been calling companies in the industry, describing me as difficult, untrustworthy, and potentially litigious. My savings dwindled as May turned to June with no job prospects. Depression settled over me like a heavy blanket. Had I been wrong to question the licensing issues? Should I have simply looked the other way like everyone else? The self-doubt was almost worse than the financial stress. Jessica remained my only contact from Vertex, keeping me updated through careful, sporadic communications. "They're scrambling to prepare for the external audit," she reported. "Bradley's having the new guy restructure all the documentation you flagged." Then on a sweltering July afternoon, I received a call from an unfamiliar number. "Is this Tracy Williams?" a woman's crisp voice inquired. "Yes. Who's calling?" "My name is Eleanor Barnes with Frost Sullivan Legal. We represent SynthTech, the company that owns SynthLogic. I'm calling because your name appears on several licensing documents with Vertex Technologies that are currently under investigation." My stomach dropped. Investigation. SynthTech is conducting a comprehensive audit of Vertex's use of the SynthLogic framework. Preliminary findings indicate significant licensing violations. As the designated licensing authority listed on the documentation, you're potentially liable for these violations. The room seemed to spin around me. This was my worst fear realized. I never authorized those agreements, I managed to say. My signature was added without my consent months before I even joined the company. A pause. That's a serious allegation, Miss Williams. Do you have any evidence to support it? Yes, I replied without hesitation. Substantial evidence. In that case, Eleanor said, her tone shifting slightly, we'd like to meet with you before proceeding further. This matter involves potential fraud in the tens of millions of dollars. After the call ended, I sat motionless, trying to process what had happened. The fraudulent scheme I had uncovered was unraveling, but instead of feeling vindicated, I felt terrified. I was being pulled into a legal battle against a company with vastly more resources than I had. That night, I barely slept, haunted by visions of financial ruin and a destroyed reputation. By morning, however, a new emotion had taken hold: determination. I hadn't created this situation, but I would fight with everything I had to protect myself and expose the truth. I called Jessica first thing. SynthTech is investigating Vertex for licensing violations, I told her. They contacted me because my name is on the documents. Oh God, she breathed. It's happening. Bradley's been in closed-door meetings all week, and there are rumors of SynthTech representatives coming next month. That same day, I used nearly a third of my remaining savings to retain Patricia Alvarez, an attorney specializing in intellectual property and employment law. After reviewing my evidence, she looked up at me with a grim smile. They really screwed up, she said. Forging your signature and making you the scapegoat for their fraud was not only unethical, but likely criminal. We have a strong case for wrongful termination and potentially much more. For the first time since my firing, I felt a flicker of hope. The truth might actually come to light, and with it a measure of justice. What I couldn't yet know was just how complete that justice would be, or that in less than a month, I would watch Bradley Reynolds' carefully constructed empire crumble before my eyes. The 3 weeks following my conversation with SynthTech's lawyers were a blur of preparation. Patricia Alvarez helped me organize my evidence chronologically, creating a compelling narrative of corporate malfeasance and deliberate fraud. The key, Patricia explained, is demonstrating that you acted appropriately at every stage while Vertex executives deliberately circumvented proper licensing procedures and made you the scapegoat. My documentation was substantial. I had copies of the original SynthLogic license agreement, the forged amendments with my signature emails showing my attempts to address compliance issues, and the sham performance reviews used to justify my termination. Jessica continued to be an invaluable ally, secretly providing internal documents, showing how Bradley and Marcus had responded to my concerns. They've been destroying documents, Jessica texted one evening. IT was instructed to purge certain email threads. They don't know I have backups. The most damning evidence came from accounting records Jessica managed to obtain. These showed that while Vertex was paying for a basic 25-user SynthLogic license, they were deploying the framework across their entire customer base of over 3,000 companies. The violation wasn't minor, it was systematic and deliberate. Patricia arranged for me to meet with Eleanor Barnes and the SynthTech legal team before the formal audit meeting. In a downtown law office, I walked them through the evidence, answering their increasingly astonished questions. So, to be clear, Eleanor said you discovered these violations, reported them internally, were silenced, then fired, and your signature was forged on licensing documents to make you the responsible party. That's correct, I confirmed. The signature on those amendments isn't mine, and the date precedes my employment at Vertex. Eleanor exchanged glances with her colleagues. Miss Williams, would you be willing to participate in the formal audit meeting next week? Your testimony would be valuable in understanding the full scope of what occurred. The thought of facing Bradley and Marcus again made my stomach clench, but I nodded. Yes, I'll be there. As the date of the audit approached, my anxiety mounted. Patricia coached me on maintaining composure and sticking to facts rather than emotions. They'll try to discredit you, she warned. Bradley will likely portray you as disgruntled and incompetent. Don't take the bait. The night before the audit, Jessica called with an update. The office is in complete chaos, she reported. Marcus canceled all executive meetings for tomorrow. Bradley's been shredding documents in his office. They know something big is coming. Sleep eluded me that night. I rehearsed what I would say, imagined every possible scenario, and tried to prepare for the confrontation to come. By morning, exhaustion had given way to a strange calm. The truth was on my side. I had done nothing wrong. Whatever happened in that meeting, I would hold my head high. The audit was scheduled for 10 a.m. at Vertex headquarters. Walking back into the building where I'd been so humiliatingly escorted out was surreal. The security guard at the front desk did a double take when I presented my visitor badge, clearly recognizing me but saying nothing. Patricia met me in the lobby, professional and poised in a charcoal suit. "Remember, stick to the facts," she murmured as we rode the elevator. "Let them dig their own graves." The main conference room was already crowded when we arrived. On one side sat the SynthTech representatives Eleanor Barnes, 2 other attorneys, and a technical auditor. On the other side, looking increasingly uncomfortable, were Marcus Bradley, Amanda, and Daniel Harris, Vertex's legal counsel. Bradley's eyes widened in alarm when I walked in. He leaned over to whisper something urgent to his father, who glanced at me with a mixture of surprise and concern. Amanda studied her notepad, intently refusing to make eye contact. Eleanor Barnes opened the meeting. "Thank you all for gathering today. SynthTech has initiated this audit due to concerns about potential licensing violations regarding the SynthLogic framework deployed within Vertex's DataSense product." Daniel Harris attempted to project confidence. "Vertex Technologies has always maintained strict compliance with all licensing agreements. We've prepared documentation demonstrating our adherence to the terms of our SynthLogic license." "We look forward to reviewing that documentation," Eleanor replied coolly. "However, we have received information suggesting significant discrepancies between your licensed usage and actual deployment." Bradley interjected. "Whatever information you've received is likely incomplete or taken out of context. Our compliance is managed by experienced professionals." His eyes flicked dismissively toward me. Eleanor ignored him and continued. "Our preliminary investigation indicates that Vertex is deploying SynthLogic components across your entire customer base while paying for a limited development license. This represents a potential violation valued at approximately $37 million. The number hung in the air like a thunderclap. Marcus paled visibly while Bradley shifted in his seat. "That's absurd," Bradley scoffed, though his voice lacked conviction. "We have proper documentation for all our usage." "Yes, let's discuss that documentation," Eleanor said, opening a folder. "We have copies of several license amendments purportedly authorized by Tracy Williams as your designated licensing authority. Miss Williams, could you speak to these documents?" All eyes turned to me. I took a steadying breath. "Those amendments contain a forgery of my signature. They're dated March 15th of last year, 3 months before I joined Vertex. Furthermore, I was never informed that I was being designated as the licensing authority for SynthLogic, nor did I consent to that responsibility." Bradley immediately went on the attack. "Tracy was terminated for performance issues. She's clearly making these claims out of spite." Patricia smoothly interjected. "We have documented evidence supporting Miss Williams's account, including the original employment contract, showing her start date and expert analysis of the signature forgery." For the next hour, I methodically presented my evidence, keeping my voice steady and professional, despite Bradley's attempts to interrupt and discredit me. I explained how I had discovered the licensing discrepancies, my attempts to address them internally, and the retaliatory measures that followed. The SynthTech auditor confirmed my technical assessment. Based on server logs and deployment data, Vertex is indeed using SynthLogic far beyond the scope of their license agreement. As the evidence mounted, the atmosphere in the room shifted perceptibly. Daniel Harris began taking extensive notes, his expression increasingly troubled. Marcus stared at his son with something between disbelief and anger. Amanda looked physically ill. Then came the moment that changed everything. Eleanor Barnes slid a document across the table to Daniel. "This is the most recent amendment to the SynthLogic license dated January of this year, expanding deployment authorization while maintaining the same minimal fee structure." Daniel examined it carefully, then looked up in confusion. "I've never seen this document before." Eleanor fixed her gaze on Bradley. It bears your signature as Vice President of Operations Mr. Reynolds, as well as Miss Williams's as the designated licensing authority. Yet Miss Williams was fired in April, and our forensic analysis indicates this document was created in May. The room went completely still. Then Eleanor asked the question that would shatter Bradley's empire: why is her name on the $89 million license? When the documentation shows she objected to the arrangement, Bradley opened his mouth, then closed it without speaking. Marcus looked at his son in horror as the implications became clear. The silence stretched for what seemed like eternity, until Amanda suddenly spoke, her voice shaking. Tracy never signed any of those documents. Bradley instructed me to add her name to shield the executives from liability after our previous compliance manager raised concerns. Daniel Harris set down his pen with a sharp click. Are you saying company executives knowingly falsified licensing documents and committed fraud? Amanda nodded, tears welling in her eyes. It wasn't just the licensing. The entire valuation of the company depends on functionality we never properly licensed. When Tracy started asking questions, Bradley saw her as a threat. Bradley exploded. Shut up, Amanda! You don't know what you're talking about. But the dam had broken. Amanda continued. Everything Tracy has said is true. She identified legitimate compliance issues and was silenced, then made a scapegoat. I was too afraid for my own job to support her. Marcus finally spoke, his voice barely audible. My God, Bradley, what have you done? The meeting descended into chaos. As Bradley tried to backpedal, Daniel attempted to assess the legal exposure, and Marcus sat in stunned silence. Through it all, I maintained my composure, watching the house of cards collapse, exactly as I had predicted it would. As the meeting adjourned, Eleanor approached me privately. Miss Williams Synthtech will be pursuing legal action against Vertex, but I want to assure you that we recognize you as a whistleblower, not a participant in the fraud. Your cooperation has been invaluable. Walking out of that conference room, I felt a weight lift from my shoulders. The truth had finally come to light, and with it the vindication I had been fighting for. Bradley's empire, built on fraud and intimidation, was crumbling before my eyes, and somehow I had survived to witness its fall. The aftermath of the audit meeting unfolded with stunning speed. Within 24 hours, Synthtech issued a formal notice of license violation to Vertex Technologies, demanding immediate compliance and $37 million in unpaid licensing fees. The news sent shockwaves through the company and quickly leaked to industry publications. Tech unicorn Vertex accused of massive software piracy, read the headline on TechCrunch. The article detailed how the company had built its $89 million valuation, largely on functionality it had never properly licensed. Vertex's stock, which had been trading at $46 per share, plummeted to $11 overnight. 3 days after the audit, Patricia called with unexpected news. Synthtech's legal team reached out, she said. They've officially cleared you of any wrongdoing and want to issue a formal statement recognizing you as a whistleblower who attempted to correct the violations. The relief was overwhelming, so I'm completely in the clear. Better than that, Patricia replied. They're considering you for their new compliance advisory board. They were impressed by your integrity and expertise. Meanwhile, Vertex was imploding. Jessica reported that Bradley had been placed on administrative leave pending investigation, and Marcus had temporarily stepped down as CEO. An emergency board meeting resulted in the appointment of an interim executive team to manage the crisis. The board hired an independent law firm to conduct an internal investigation, Jessica told me during our now regular coffee meetings. They've been interviewing everyone, and guess what? People are talking. No one wants to go down with Bradley's ship. Amanda was among the first to cooperate fully, with investigators providing detailed accounts of how Bradley had systematically circumvented proper licensing procedures and silenced anyone who raised concerns. Daniel Harris, the company lawyer, admitted he had been kept in the dark about many of the legal documents bearing his department's approval. As the investigation progressed, my phone began ringing with calls from companies seeking licensing compliance consultants. Word had spread about my role in uncovering the Vertex fraud, and suddenly my expertise was in demand. After weeks of unemployment and uncertainty, I found myself with multiple job offers. 6 weeks after the audit, the full investigation report was completed and summarized in a press release. The findings were damning. Bradley Reynolds had orchestrated a deliberate scheme to use synth logic beyond licensed parameters, saving millions in proper licensing fees while building Vertex's valuation on functionality. They had no legal right to deploy. When employees raised concerns, they were silenced, marginalized, and ultimately removed. The board of directors took decisive action. Bradley was terminated for cause and faced potential criminal charges for fraud and forgery. Marcus, while not directly implicated in the fraud, was removed as CEO for failure to provide adequate oversight. Amanda received a formal reprimand but retained her position after cooperating with investigators. Most vindicating for me was the section of the report addressing my termination. The investigation found that Tracy Williams was wrongfully terminated after appropriately identifying compliance issues that threatened the company. Her dismissal was part of a pattern of retaliatory actions against employees who raised legitimate concerns about licensing practices. Jessica was promoted to senior financial analyst after the toxic leadership was removed. The new management team actually listens when I raise questions, she marveled during one of our dinners. It's like working at a completely different company. The legal consequences continued to unfold. SynthTech pursued both civil penalties and criminal charges related to the fraud. I was called to testify in depositions, providing detailed accounts of what I had observed and the evidence I had gathered. Each time I presented the facts calmly and professionally, refusing to be baited into expressing personal animosity toward Bradley or the company. 3 months after the audit, Patricia called with news that Vertex's new management wanted to discuss a settlement. They're offering a substantial financial package in exchange for you signing an agreement not to pursue further legal action against the company. My first instinct was to refuse. Money wasn't what I wanted. I wanted justice and restoration of my professional reputation. What do you recommend? I asked Patricia. Consider it carefully, she advised. The new management is trying to clean up Bradley's mess. This settlement acknowledges the wrong done to you and provides compensation for your suffering. We can also negotiate terms regarding public acknowledgement of your role and clearing your professional record. After careful consideration, I agreed to settlement discussions with specific, non-negotiable conditions: a public apology, formal retraction of all negative employment records, and outreach to companies where Bradley had blacklisted me. The financial compensation was secondary to restoring my professional standing. Vertex's new CEO, a respected industry veteran named Richard Thornton, personally called to apologize. "What happened to you was inexcusable," he said. "Your integrity and professionalism should have been valued, not punished. We're committed to making this right." The settlement was finalized in September, including a substantial financial package that provided long-term security. More importantly to me, Vertex issued a public statement acknowledging my valuable contributions to identifying compliance issues and expressing regret for my unjustified termination. With my reputation restored and finances secured, I accepted a position as Director of Licensing Compliance at Meridian Software, a company known for its ethical business practices. My new team was supportive and appreciative of my expertise, creating an environment where integrity was valued rather than punished. At an industry conference in November, I unexpectedly encountered Bradley Reynolds. Stripped of his executive position and facing ongoing legal troubles, he looked diminished somehow, the arrogance replaced by uncertainty. He approached me at the reception, clearing his throat awkwardly. "Tracy, I wanted to say that things got out of hand at Vertex. I never meant for it to go so far." I studied him for a moment, noting the lack of any actual apology or acknowledgement of wrongdoing. Even now, he couldn't bring himself to take responsibility. "Goodbye, Bradley," I said, simply turning away to rejoin my new colleagues. Walking away from that conversation, I realized I no longer carried anger toward him. Bradley would face the consequences of his actions both legally and professionally. His empire had crumbled under the weight of his own deception, and I had emerged stronger, wiser, and more confident in my values than ever before. The vindication I had fought for was complete, but the journey had taught me something far more valuable than any settlement could provide: the unshakable knowledge that integrity, even when costly, is always the right choice in the end. 1 year after the SynthTech audit that changed everything, I stood at the podium of the National Software Compliance Conference as the keynote speaker. Looking out at the audience of 500 industry professionals, I took a moment to appreciate just how far I had come from that devastating day when Bradley had fired me with a smirk and the words "lost cause" removed. "Thank you all for being here today," I began. "My journey over the past year has taught me that in the world of software compliance, doing the right thing isn't always the easy thing, but it is always, without exception, the necessary thing." The 12 months since the Vertex implosion had been transformative. My role at Meridian Software had evolved from Director of Compliance to Vice President of Licensing and Ethics, where I oversaw a team dedicated to maintaining the highest standards of software licensing integrity. The company's leadership valued my expertise, and more importantly, respected my commitment to ethical practices. The emotional healing took longer than the professional rehabilitation. For months after the settlement, I struggled with trust issues in my new workplace. Every team meeting triggered anxiety. Every question about my work felt like a potential attack. My confidence had been severely damaged by the gaslighting and retaliation I'd experienced at Vertex. The hardest part wasn't being fired, I confided to Jessica over dinner 6 months after everything happened. It was doubting myself. There were days I genuinely wondered if I was the problem. Jessica, who had thrived in the restructured Vertex under new leadership, nodded in understanding. That's what toxic environments do. They make you question your own reality. Gradually, through the support of a therapist specializing in workplace trauma and the consistent positive reinforcement from my new team, I rebuilt my professional confidence. Each successful project, each acknowledgement of my expertise, helped repair the damage Bradley and Amanda had inflicted. The industry landscape had shifted dramatically in the wake of the Vertex scandal. Software compliance suddenly became a top priority for companies fearing similar exposures. New regulations were proposed requiring independent verification of enterprise license usage. My experience made me a sought-after consultant for companies implementing more transparent compliance frameworks. Vertex Technologies itself underwent a complete transformation. After paying the $37 million settlement to SynthTech and properly licensing all software, the company's valuation dropped to $26 million. Richard Thornton led a comprehensive restructuring, cutting flashy but unprofitable initiatives started under Bradley's leadership and refocusing on sustainable growth. The human consequences were equally significant. Bradley Reynolds was barred from serving as an officer in publicly traded companies following an SEC investigation. Criminal charges for fraud and forgery resulted in a suspended sentence and substantial community service. His professional reputation was irreparably damaged. Marcus Reynolds lost over 60% of his personal fortune when Vertex's stock collapsed. In an unexpected development, he reached out to me through Patricia 6 months after the settlement. "He wants to meet with you," Patricia explained. "Says he wants to apologize in person." I agreed to coffee at a neutral location, curious what Marcus would say. When we met, he looked older, the arrogance replaced by humility. "I failed as a leader and as a father," he admitted, stirring his untouched coffee. "I gave Bradley too much power without proper oversight because I wanted to believe in him. I ignored warning signs that should have been obvious." "Why did you let it go so far?" I asked the question that had bothered me for months. Marcus sighed heavily. "Pride. SynthLogic transformed our business, but the proper licensing would have cost millions we didn't have at the time. Once we started down that path, each decision to continue the deception seemed easier than admitting what we'd done. By the time you joined, the company's entire valuation depended on functionality we had no right to use." His honesty was unexpected and somewhat healing. Marcus had faced consequences for his failures, but was attempting to make amends. He had started a new venture, focused on ethical business practices and transparent software compliance. As the months passed, I connected with other whistleblowers from various industries, forming a support network for those who had faced retaliation for doing the right thing. Our monthly gatherings became a safe space to share experiences and strategies for rebuilding careers after standing up against workplace misconduct. One unexpected outcome was a friendship with Amanda Chen. After the Vertex restructuring, she reached out to apologize for her role in my termination. Initially skeptical, I agreed to hear her out. "I was a coward," she admitted during our first tense meeting. I knew what Bradley was doing was wrong, but I was afraid of losing my job if I supported you. While I couldn't immediately forgive her, I appreciated her honesty. Over time, as she demonstrated genuine remorse, through actions rather than just words, we developed a cautious professional relationship that eventually evolved into friendship. At Meridian, I implemented comprehensive compliance training, emphasizing that ethical concerns should be welcomed rather than punished. Questions and concerns are gifts, I told my team repeatedly. They identify problems before they become crises. My personal documentation habit became legendary. If it isn't documented, it didn't happen, became my mantra one. I passed on to colleagues and mentees. The meticulous records that had saved me from taking the fall for Vertex's fraud became a professional practice I evangelized throughout the industry. Standing at the podium of the compliance conference, I concluded my keynote with the lessons I had learned through fire. Integrity isn't just a nice corporate value to hang on the wall, I told the audience. It's a daily practice of choosing what's right over what's expedient, even when that choice comes with personal cost. I lost a job by maintaining my integrity, but I gained something far more valuable, the unshakable knowledge that I can face myself in the mirror each morning without regret. The applause was gratifying, but more meaningful were the conversations afterward with compliance professionals facing similar challenges. My story had given them courage to address issues in their own organizations. That evening, as I returned to my hotel room, I received a text from Jessica with a news link. Bradley Reynolds had attempted to launch a new startup, but failed to secure funding after investors discovered his history. The final line of the article noted that he was now working in a mid-level sales position at a small company, his dreams of running an empire permanently shattered. I felt no joy at his downfall, only a sense of appropriate consequences. My focus remained on building something positive from my experience, rather than celebrating another's failure. As I prepare to start my second year at Meridian, I'm grateful for the hard lessons learned through the Vertex ordeal. The experience taught me to trust my instincts, value my expertise, document everything, and never compromise on matters of integrity. Most importantly, it showed me that even in the darkest professional moments, standing firm for what's right eventually leads to something better than what was lost. The journey from being called a lost cause to becoming a respected industry voice on ethics and compliance wasn't one I would have chosen, but it's a path I now walk with pride. Sometimes, our greatest growth comes through our hardest challenges, and the moments that seem to break us actually remake us into something stronger than before. What about you? Have you ever had to stand up for what's right when it wasn't easy? Drop a comment below and share your experience. If this story resonated with you, please hit that like button and subscribe to hear more journeys of resilience and integrity. Your support helps these stories reach others who might need to hear that standing for truth, even when costly, is always worth it in the end. Thank you for listening, and remember, your integrity is your most valuable professional asset. Guard it fiercely even when others try to make you doubt its worth.